In the first paragraph of Politics and the English Language by George Orwell, Orwell himself, by his own definition of not thinking, was not thinking about what he said. Okay? So I'm going to explain what I mean. So I'm just going to be talking about the first paragraph of Politics and the English Language, one of the most well-known essays of the 20th century in English by George Orwell, okay, the author of 1984, and Animal Farm and so on. Here, I'm going to read the paragraph. Here's the paragraph. Here's how Politics and the English Language begins. Most people who bother with the matter at all would admit that the English language is in a bad way, but it is generally assumed that we cannot, by conscious action, do anything about it. Our civilization is decadent, and our language, so the argument runs, must inevitably share in the general collapse. It follows that any struggle against the abuse of language is a sentimental archaism, like preferring candles to electric light or hansom cabs to airplanes. Underneath this lies the half-conscious belief that our language is a natural growth and not an instrument which we shape for our own purposes. Okay, that's the first paragraph. If you go to Google, you could Google the essay and read the paragraph yourself to check out what I'm saying. But anyway, so I'm making the claim that according to Orwell's own definition, he is not thinking. So if we look later in the essay, I'll read what I mean. Orwell says later in the essay, about 6 pages in, he says the sole aim of a metaphor is to call up a visual image. So when you use a metaphor, you're calling up a visual image. The main purpose of a metaphor is to call up a visual image. When these images clash, okay, mixed metaphors, that's what he's talking about, clashing metaphors, as in the fascist octopus has sung its swan song, or the jackboot is thrown into the melting pot, it can be taken as certain that the writer is not seeing a mental image of the objects he is naming. In other words, he is not really thinking. Okay? So, when Orwell says that when you use metaphors that clash, that contradict each other, you're not really thinking. So, let's look at the very first paragraph. I'm going to show you that in this first paragraph of Politics and the English Language, Orwell is not really thinking because he is using metaphors that clash. He's not thinking. He has an idea and he picks images or pictures that go against what he's trying to communicate. So let me explain what I mean. So I'll read the paragraph again. Most people who bother with the matter at all would admit that the English language is in a bad way. Okay? Whether you agree or not, doesn't really matter. We'll take him at his word. The English language is in a bad way. I'm going to show you that in this, later on in the essay, Orwell says the very faults that he's pointing out that other people make, if you look at his essay, you'll find the same faults in him. Okay, this is an example. This is an example of bad writing. So, Orwell's saying the language is full of bad habits, and I'm going to show you that in this first paragraph, he himself commits the very faults he points out in others. Most people in this world, most people who bother with the matter at all, would admit that the English language is in a bad way. Okay? But it is generally assumed that we cannot, by conscious efforts, do anything about it. Okay, the English language is messed up. We can't do anything about it. That's the assumption. Our civilization is decadent, and our language, so the argument runs, must inevitably share in the general collapse. Decadent civilization, therefore decadent language. Okay, that's no problem so far. It follows that any struggle against the abuse of language is a from that argument, decadent civilization, therefore you're going to have decadent language. It follows that any struggle against the abuse of language, hey, why try to struggle against the abuse of language? You're not going to win. It's inevitable that language is going to be decadent. Decadent civilization, decadent language. It follows that any struggle against the abuse of language is a sentimental archaism. Now here, this is simile. Now you could picture this stuff. Similes are like metaphors, except they use the word like. Instead of saying a person's a tiger, that's a metaphor. You say he's like a tiger. Okay, but the idea, but similes and metaphors both are based upon evoking visual images in the mind. It follows that any struggle against the abuse of language is a sentimental archaism. Okay, now we can picture this. Preferring candles. So just think about it. If you have a piece of paper, write candles on one side to electric lights on the other side. Preferring candles to electric lights. Or hansom cabs to airplanes. Okay, hansom cabs to airplanes. Okay. If you want to replace airplanes with hansom cabs, we're not going back. Planes are here to stay. We're not going back to cabs. If you want to get rid of airplanes and go back, it's a sentimental archaism to want to go back and replace airplanes with hansom cabs. Or if you want to, I don't like these electric lights, modern technology, let's just get rid of electric lights. Let's go back to candles. It's not going to happen. Okay, so, you say, we have good language, bad language. Let's get rid of the bad language, decadent language, go back to the good language. Orwell said, no, it ain't going to happen. It's like getting rid of airplanes, going back to hansom cabs. Getting rid of decadent language, going back to good language, whenever that was. It's not going to happen. Sentimental archaism. It follows that any struggle against the abuse of language is a sentimental archaism, like preferring candles to electric lights, or hansom cabs to airplanes. Now, think about here. Here's what the key. Here's where the Orwell gets messed up. Underneath this, the comparison I just made, preferring candles to electric lights, hansom cabs to airplanes. Underlying this comparison lies the half-conscious belief that language is a natural growth and not an instrument which we shape for our own purposes. Now just think about what he said. Underlying this lies the half-conscious belief that language is a natural growth. So on one side, natural growth. That makes you think of organic things, people, plants, and so on. Things that grow. Underlying this lies the half-conscious belief that language is a natural growth and not an instrument which we shape for our own purposes. Underlying this lies the half-conscious belief that language is a natural growth and not an instrument which we shape for our own purposes. So Orwell is saying that underlying this comparison, the idea that we can't restore a good language, we're stuck in a decadent language, underlying this comparison lies the half-conscious belief that language is a natural growth and not, as Orwell thinks it really is, an instrument which we shape to our own purposes. That doesn't make sense. Think of underlying this comparison. He says, you have on the one hand decadent language, good language. Okay, so good language is to bad language or decadent language, as I'll focus on the hansom cabs to the airplane. The hansom cabs are good. Airplanes are bad, You want to, so we don't like airplanes. We want to go back to a better time, right? Hansom cabs. Hansom cabs are to airplanes as good language is to bad language, right? Whereas candles are to electricity. Well, underlying this comparison is the view that language is an instrument which was shaped to our purposes. Airplanes are not a natural growth. Airplanes do not grow out of the ground. Airplanes and candles are instruments that we shape to our own purpose. Candles and electricity are things that we shape to our own purpose. They're not natural growth. What Orwell should have said is that underlying this comparison as preferring, good language to bad language is like comparing candles to electricity is the idea or the assumption that language is an instrument that we shape to our own purposes, because candles and electricity are instruments. They're not examples of natural growth. But Orwell says underlying this lies the half-conscious belief that language is a natural growth. No. Orwell's not thinking. He's not thinking of the metaphors that he used, or the similes that he used. He's not thinking of the pictures. The picture of a candle, electric light, hansom cab, and airplanes, that shouldn't make you think of natural growth, because they're not organic. They're not. They're instruments that we shape to our purpose. So Orwell is saying something that his pictures don't say. They said the exact opposite. He's not mixing metaphors so much as he's not thinking about the metaphors or the similes. He's not picturing what he's saying. If he was truly picturing the candles and electric light, he would not be thinking of natural growth. He'd be thinking about instruments that we shape to our own purpose. He's not really thinking, because the metaphors that he's using, the pictures that he's developing, he's not picturing them. He looks at he's not thinking about what he's saying. He's not really thinking. And Orwell says later on, that the very faults that he himself is pointing out, he says, if you look through his essay, you will find the very faults themselves he himself commits. And so all I'm making in this lecture, in this little video, this little 10, 12 minutes, I was talking about the first paragraph, the very first paragraph of Politics in the English Language. Orwell is not thinking, because what he says underlying this lies the half-conscious, underlying this half-conscious belief is a half-conscious belief that language is a natural growth and not an instrument that will shape to our purposes. That's wrong. He got that wrong. Underlying these pictures is precisely the half-conscious belief that language is an instrument that we shape to our belief. He switched them. He switched. He got it wrong. He used the metaphors, he used the pictures, and he saw the pictures that he used, which were instruments, and he tells you that they're examples of natural growth. That doesn't make sense. So according to Orwell's own definition of not thinking, he's not thinking in the very first paragraph. I will stop at this point. But Orwell is a great writer. He's great. He's a great writer. And Orwell wouldn't be upset with what I said. He said, yeah, okay, I wasn't thinking. Yeah, mea culpa.